Hey, what's up, everyone? Unnerved, back with you again on another Star Wars Destiny video. In this video, I'm going to do a deck tech on FatBucket. Link to the deck will be in the notes, so if you want to jump right to the deck, feel free to do so. However, if you want to hear my thoughts on this deck, how to play this deck, and ultimately why I think this deck is underrated in the meta, stick around. All right, so let's jump right in here. First, we do Elite Phasma, Elite Jabba the Hutt. Now, I chose Phasma and Jabba because when I got to looking at their dice side by side, you'll see that Phasma has a focus side, Jabba has two focus sides, Phasma has a discard side, Jabba has a discard side, Phasma has a resource side, Jabba has a resource side. Jabba picks up the two disrupt, and Phasma picks up one range and two range. I know a lot of people are like, well, I don't want to use Phasma because her ability is basically blank in this deck. And don't get me wrong, I think Phasma's Guardian, giving Guardian to non-unique characters is super powerful, particularly for the points. However, for 15 points, Phasma's dice are very good. They offer very good consistency. There's no modified sides here, so whatever we attach to Phasma, if we're looking for damage, Phasma is going to provide you with a stable damage base moving forward for anything that you attach to her. So one of the common things I hear a lot when I talk to people about this deck is, well, then let's just go for Phasma, and then once Phasma is gone, Jabba does basically nothing. And I would agree. It's very important that you play this deck right. And this is not an easy deck to play. I would say if you're intending to play this deck or you want to give it a try, I want to hear your thoughts on it too. However, I will say this, after many, many games, I played this deck in Awakenings before Spirit of Rebellion came out, and I had pretty good success with it, although I went through a number of losses to find kind of the combination that works here. So a couple of things. Number one, if we win the battlefield, great. If we don't, it's not that big of a deal. Rebel Warming is a really good battlefield for this deck because there are quite a few dice that ultimately are going to have some payment costs. So there are times when maybe Phasma is not around and your holdout blaster or your F11D are going to roll, and they're going to roll with the payment side. And that creates a couple of difficult components here, because if you can't resolve that, then you really lose out on kind of the consistent damage output that this deck can do. At its core, this is an aggro deck. However, I like to call it a hybrid between an aggro and a control deck. And it's really more of a control deck than an aggro deck. So I'm actually going to start with the supports and events in this deck instead of talking about upgrades first. And because I think they are the key to making this deck operate. I don't think this deck is fully dialed in for Spirit of Rebellion yet. This was me taking my Awakenings deck, making some modifications to it for what I think are good Spirit of Rebellion cards in this deck, and then going from there. It may be potentially possible that All In needs to be back included here. I included a single copy of We Have Them Now, which I'll talk about in the future, and I'm not sure that will stay, and All In may come back to the deck. So let's talk about some of this. First, we're going to start with our supports. We're going to play two backup muscles. This card has so much mileage, even in Spirit of Rebellion, with faster gameplay going on. The unblockable damage is not something that you can just look past, and it has won me games more often than not, in fact, because it's just 6 damage. And this deck outputs consistent damage, but backup muscle just helps kind of push the damage ceiling a little further. Sometimes that one extra damage is all you need to kill a character. Sometimes that one extra damage is just enough to make your opponent reconsider how to play because they're afraid that once you roll out, you might roll the damage to kill their character. So there's a lot of psychological impact that backup muscle has on the game. Two new additions for Spirit of Rebellions that I think are really good here is Imperial Inspection and Salvage Stand, and I'm running 2 of each of these. Now, Imperial Inspection is where you roll a disrupt, and then you can return an opponent's upgrade back to hand. So the games that I lost early on in Awakenings, a lot of it what it came down to was this deck is not fast, and because of it, my opponent could get their final characters set up. And those final characters set up that way could provide a lot of problems for me because you have to be really aggressive in the early game to push it to the long game. And by aggressive, I don't mean necessarily just damage. I also mean in terms of discarding cards or electroshocking dice away, or he doesn't like you. He doesn't like you cards. Those are the things that we really spend a lot of time doing. So Imperial Inspection, if it comes down early, is great. You get more mileage out of it, but it's really there for the end game to help keep your opponent um, two costing upgrades out of play, which there are a significant number of two costing upgrades being played around the meta right now. I know that that's going to probably shift. Imperial Inspection is getting a lot of attention, and particularly in other versions of Jabba, as well as in Unkar Plut decks. So what we may find is as the meta evolves, there may be less and less targets for inspection, and it may lose some of its value as a two of in this deck. It may always remain a one of. But for now, until the meta shifts, I think Imperial Inspection is a great card for that. Salvage Stand is the second component piece to this kind of combo. Between Phasma and Jabba, there's a lot of resources that can get rolled here, combined with the upgrades that we have going into play. And Salvage Stand just allows you to take away resources. Even disrupting one resource matters if you can use Salvage Stand to your advantage. Disrupting two by having two Salvage Stands in play is extremely good, and it really puts your opponent off tempo the entire game. And some of these really fast decks that are using Ray and Poe and some of that, tempo is everything for them. For example, you might get a Poe special and want to roll it to a rocket launcher, but if I roll in and I get a resource to kill the final resource on Poe, or to kill the final two resources on Poe if I got double salvage down, which is really good, then that person can't resolve the Poe special with rocket launcher and do 4 damage. That's a huge, huge tempo swing in my favor. So then let's move into the event suite. So I run 12 events in the deck. The 12 events are bait and switch, which is pure upside in this deck in so many different ways. Number one, it goes, okay, well, here's bait and switch. I'm going to ambush. I'm going to change this resource side on Jabba. You can change that to discard. You can change that to disrupt. You can change that to focus. And then you can go, okay, with ambush, I'm going to resolve focus. Bait and switch is the enabler there for Jabba to get other things happening. Or you go over to the Captain Phasma side, and let's say you roll Phasma out and you got a bunch of modified sides, maybe 1 damage showing, but you got that 1 resource showing. Well, your opponent's probably going to try to take out your 1 damage because your modifiers are blank, right? And every modifier pretty much in this deck is a +2. And so because of that, you can then go, all right, bait and switch, ambush it. You flip that Phasma resource to the 2 side, you use your ambush action, you resolve 6 damage into your opponent. Nobody can really be upset about that. That's all upside for a 0 cost event, and I think it works really, really well in this deck. It will be a staple for me in this deck going forward for a long time. I did run in the Awakenings version of this deck 2 copies of Dug In. May go back to this, but what I'm finding is with the really super fast decks, I'm not getting the battlefield as often, and so things like Dug In are becoming harder and harder to play unless you're also playing a super fast deck. This is not a super fast deck. It is a medium tempo deck, and even when you're down to 1 character, may still be a slower deck. I alleviated some of that in Awakenings with all-ins, but I'm not playing all-ins in this version just because I added in the Imperial Inspection and the Salvage Stand, and so depending on how that all works out, I may be coming back to all-in this deck at some point. But for now, in this version of the deck, I'm running a single copy of Dug In. 2x Electroshock is just all upside. Anytime you can get rid of dice that are going to have a significant impact on you, that's for the better. I'm not afraid to use Electroshocks on modified sides, especially if I'm playing up against like Poe decks, or I'm playing up against Vader decks where the 3 comes out and I don't have my dice in the pool yet. Electroshock is about the only way you can get rid of that 3, or not the 3, but any of the modifiers that may be going with it. Especially now, like when you see Vader Royal Guard, and some of these other decks that are really pushing out some modified sides. Makashi Training is pretty much all +2s. So Electroshock has got more targets now, and maybe they're not the non-modified sides where you're going to take 0 damage, but it's far better to take 3 than it is to take 5. And so that's the way I look at things. Ultimately, is I'm looking to extend the game as long as possible, and Electroshock allows me to do that. I'm running now as a new addition, Friends in Low Places. I've tested this deck with Probe a number of times. Probe was pretty good for me overall, but I really like looking at my opponent's hand. So a yellow event for 0 that allows me to look at my opponent's hand and allows me to discard a card that costs an event that costs 1 or less. This is all upside. I think that this is a good addition to any deck that's wanting to try to control their opponent. It just changes what they intend to do. Take those 4 strikes away. Take away the willpowers and the power cards that could give you problems. There's so many different 1 or less costing events that are impactful to the game now that friends in low places can just hit. I'm running 2 of If He Doesn't Like You. This is another card that, for me, just kind of needs more time in Spirit of Rebellion to understand whether it's still good or not. If I was playing other card games, I would say He Doesn't Like You is not a good card. It has too much situation. I'm losing something. We're trading in my disfavor, which is a 2-to-1. I'm losing the card plus a dice to remove an opponent's dice. But right now, there is upside in that is one of the few ways I can actually hit my opponent's 3 dice side, and it costs 0. So that is an advantage in terms of going, okay, well, let's just take away the 3 side from Poe, the 3 side from Vader, whatever it may be. I am running 2 copies of Tactical Mastery. This is a card that, as the game goes long, if your opponent goes after Phasma, is just going to be reroll for you. It unless you get it early, it just isn't going to give you much advantage, because really what we're looking at here is we go, okay, well, we need to roll in a Phasma, and then we're going to spend 1 for a Tactical Mastery. We're going to roll in Jabba, and then we're going to use Jabba's reroll to try to fix our dice, and then we're going to do something with that final action using Jabba's dice. Typically, it's the focusing to damage, but sometimes it's focusing to those discards or whatever it may be to just take away opponents' actions. The more you can strip your opponent of actions, the better you are in terms of this deck getting set up to deal its damage without mitigation. So that's what Tactical Mastery brings to the table with this deck. It was really good as a combo piece with All In, and so Bait and Switch and Tactical Mastery could combo with All In, and so I may consider, like I said, I've All In is not off the table for me for this deck. It's still very much a possibility that I could include All In. And then the final edition, because I just think this kind of does like an all-in type of thing, and it would work with Tactical Mastery. Obviously, 3 resources could get a little expensive to do 2 events, but it is potentially possible. And so this is if I control the battlefield, I can turn up to 4 of my dice to any side showing range or melee. Doesn't care about color, which I like. Obviously, I don't have anything that's not red here, but it just that's a nice card. And 4 dice being changed to the value side of whatever you want is not something that you can just sneeze at. Okay, so now we get into the upgrade side, and then we'll talk a little bit about kind of what we want in opening hands. I'll go through some of the better opening hands and kind of go from there. So the DH-17 blaster, the baby blaster as we all call it, all upside to this blaster in terms of getting your board set up. Now this blaster needs to go on a character that is not going to get attacked first. You want this blaster to linger around and hang around as long as possible. So usually what I look for in my opening hand is an F11D or holdout blaster, which I think everybody kind of understands. So F11D or holdout blaster, both of these cost 2, so they consume all of my resources. But let's say I don't win the battlefield and I put 2 shields on Jabba. Cool. I got 2 shields on Jabba. I always recommend putting 2 shields on Jabba because a lot of players are going to focus Jabba anyways. And so then if you feel like that's the case, you can F11 to Jabba. And you can really push Jabba to be the center of your attention. If you want to leave Jabba lingering around, and in certain matchups there are reasons to leave Jabba lingering around, particularly if your opponent has a yellow character, then I would push to put F11 or Holdout Blaster onto Phasma instead. And doing so is going to put a giant bullseye on that character. This is my threat. This is the person I need to go for. And this is what I need to attack with. And then you go, okay, cool. That's the person I want to go down first. And you're going to fight like crazy to save them through dug-ins and everything else to keep them prolonged in life as long as possible, which coincidentally, both of these characters have 11 health. So your opponent has a tough decision every time. So making Jabba have more shields than Phasma means that your opponent is going to spend either more time working on Jabba or more time working on Phasma, one way or the other, depending on how you do it. All right, so once I get an F11 or holdout blaster down, if I've got a fast hands in my opening hand, great. Fast hands is going to Jabba every single time. Now you might be saying, well, why is that? Wouldn't I want to just roll damage and roll damage fast? Well, I actually think fast hands is a better card on characters that have focus sides, on characters that have discard sides, and on characters that have disrupt sides. I don't think it's as good a card on characters that are resolving damage, particularly range damage, because those cards need other supports to kind of build your damage chain, if you will. And in this deck especially, because F11D and Holdout Blaster do have, non-modified sides for sure. But F11D is heavy modified sides. Holdout Blaster is not. But ultimately, you want to ensure that if your opponent removes Phasma dice, or if you fast hands and resolve a Phasma die for 2, that you're not giving them just a completely obvious target for their removal. Meaning, like if Phasma rolls and rolls unmodified, your Holdout Blaster rolls and rolls unmodified, and your F11 rolls with modified, your opponent knows that no matter which dice they take, unless they have like a best defense or something of that nature, they can't stop from taking some damage that turn. That's a win with this deck. So fast hands is for Jabba, and you're probably asking, well, maybe why? Why should I put fast hands on Jabba? If you fast hand Jabba and you have Imperial Inspection and Salvage stand out, when you roll Jabba out, either one of those could trigger, and then afterwards, depending on what they triggered with, you may be able to just disrupt 2 right away with Jabba. You may be able to go, okay, well, Jabba rolled a disrupt 2, and then Jabba rolled a resource. All right, that triggers Imperial Inspections, that triggers Salvage stand, and that allows me to then turn around and resolve the disrupt and take my opponent's last resource away. And so this is where that kind of choke element comes into play. Or if he rolls discard side, but he's still got that resource and he took an opponent's resource away, no problem. You just go boom, discard 2. Your opponent's working with 3 less cards for the turn. They have to be respectful of that because ultimately they still wanted to play a bunch of stuff, right? They still wanted to spend resources. They still want to do this, still want to do that. And now they've only got potentially, if they play 1 card, 2 rerolls for the whole turn. Or even less if they have to mitigate your dice or do other things. So it's a really hard kind of disruption control type of element using your characters. Okay, so then the next card that I use is Imperial Discipline. Now I was running Promotion and Awakenings. I switched this out to Discipline. I think Discipline is better than Promotion in so many ways. I can't even begin to tell you why. Outside of the fact that it's got double resource side, which is going to trigger that, synergize with that salvage stand for removing resources from my opponent. It's got a +1 modifier on the range. It's got a +1 modifier on the melee. It's got a single shield. All of those things are really good. And if my dice don't turn up right on Phasma, I can just go, okay, pull this out and turn it into a raid. Great. Or if I need a resource, I'm starving for resources, my opponent's trying to short me out. Okay, great. Remove this, change the dice to a resource, get my resource. Perfect. Good to go. And then the final card is a card we want for late game only. Now, the reason why I say late game only is because you don't want to be spending tons of resources on this card. I really do not want to spend 3 resources playing IQA on a character. What I want to be doing is replacing F11Ds with IQAs. That's what I want to be doing. But I have to do that after the F11D has landed on the final character. Now you can trick that a little bit. If the final character is going to be Captain Phasma and you've got Imperial Discipline out there and you've got a Baby Blaster on her and you're kind of flush with resources and the game state looks pretty good, you could go ahead and spend 2 on the IQA, replace a DH17, and boy, you got a lot of upside with Imperial Discipline alongside that IQA. I've seen some decks run in the Commanding Presence. I think there is value for Commanding Presence in this deck, but I wouldn't really want to switch anything out for that because really when we get to the end game, Commanding Presence is not giving me enough power. If that makes sense. I know that sounds kind of strange to say, but let's say I roll in 2 from Phasma and I roll in 2 from Phasma, and then I roll in a +2 on an F11D and a +2 on a holdout blaster, right? That's living the dream. That's 8 damage every single turn. If I have another blaster, my damage ceiling is 10, perfectly rolled. If I have a commanding presence, my damage ceiling is not that high because at best I can maybe turn Phasma's 2 into a 3, or I can turn an F11 2 into 3 for 1, or a holdout blaster in from 2 to 3 for 1, or an IQA for 3 for nothing. And the problem with that is if any of my other dice get mitigated and there's modified sides showing, I'm left not able to resolve modifieds, which could leave 2, 4, 6 damage potentially on the table. And that's just not okay. I'm not okay with that kind of damage just kind of lingering out there. So commanding presence to me always felt really awkward in the deck when I played it before. It was nice removal if I was playing against an opponent that was playing red, but it just didn't give me enough upside for its cost and for what I can get out of these other cards that are in the mix here. Now I include Rebel War Room as my starting point. This is the deck I played an awful lot with this in Awakenings. Since this deck isn't fast to claim, there are some advantages here. Number one, let's say you've got a modified side out there, you got a bunch of blanks, and you're looking at the only way you can really do anything is maybe you got one reroll left. Okay, so you go to do the reroll, or maybe you don't really want to get rid of that card for the reroll. You don't have the resource to resolve that modified damage. You can just claim, get your modified damage. But that's the most obvious case of it. The other non-obvious case of it is like your opponent's still doing a bunch of, he's playing a slower deck or she's playing a slower deck. They're doing a bunch of re-rolling, and you're sitting there going, cool, they're not ready to claim yet. I can look at it and go, well, I've got this discard side. I'm going to force them to discard. And they're out of cards in hand. They can't re-roll anymore. I also not only made them discard, I claimed. So I go, okay, claim, discard 2 cards. They have no more rerolls left. They have to resolve their dice on the battlefield as they sit. And I've got the battlefield to start. So like I get all swing. I get kind of a really big tempo swing from Rebel War Room. But I'm not like crazy enough about it to say like if you win your roll, you should take Rebel War Room every turn. Like it's not imperative that Rebel War Room exists. In fact, I'm more likely to believe that it's better off taking your opponent's, if you win the battlefield roll, to take your opponent's battlefield 9 times out of 10. The 1 time out of 10, I would say that's not the case. You don't have a lot of special sides. You definitely don't want the Emperor's Throne Room. Emperor's Throne Room is not going to help you out here. But there are plenty of other battlefields that will. And Rebel War Room is one that helps both you and your opponent. And your opponent may look at that and go, boy, I think I can claim more often, and that's good. So I'm going to take the War Room over my, I don't Mos Eisley Spaceport or something, and so therefore, ultimately, what you get is you get your shields that way, which gives you the extension of health in this deck. That kind of covers things. I'll go over some other things really quick. The card cost, there's 12 0 cost cards in this deck. There are 11 1 cost cards, 5 2 cost cards, and 2 3 cost cards. So it's got a nice smooth cost curve. The 3 cost cards are upgrades only, so they're really looking at those being 2s or 1s, which is all upside. So basically the cost curve of this deck is very low. So let's do some card drawing really quick. I just want to talk about mulligans for a second. All right, so we open up here. Bait and switch is a card we kind of want once we have a little more damage on the board. So I don't necessarily want bait and switch in my opening hand, but it's not a terrible card. Friends in Low Places are really good. The removal is really good, but I think we need to try to get an upgrade. So I'm going to drop both of those and the Friends in Low Places and draw 4 new cards. Okay, so we got an upgrade, got a backup muscle. Basically everything in this hand can be played except for the Tactical Master. So I'd probably start with a backup muscle. I'd put I'd probably put fast hands on Jabba first. Then I'd put Imperial Discipline on Phasma. That way I've got 2 upgrades. My opponent's still trying to decide who to attack. Do I take Jabba with fast hands, or do I take Phasma that's now going to do consistent damage every single turn? Then I can throw backup muscle out. I can potentially Friends in High Places or Friends in Low Places. There's a lot of different orders here depending upon what your opponent's doing. So I probably would play backup muscle last in the turn, and then we'd save the tactical mastery. So I'll reset. We'll draw a new hand of 5. Kind of the same thing. This is a pretty good open, all except for the bait and switch. I'll save the backup muscle. I'm gonna try to get an upgrade. IQA is not great here. So this is a tough open hand. This is not perfect, but we go salvage, stand, imperial inspection, get those out, get them set up. We're building into our turn. We can try to discard an event from our opponent's hand. Still haven't spent any resources. We may get a resource to get IQA out. I mean, this is potentially possible. Ideally, we would go for who your opponent's not attacking. So I would roll this turn out since it's turn 1. Figure out who your opponent's going to focus on and throw the IQA on the opposite character. Or I can use electroshock to mitigate and kind of go from there. So we'll do one more hand here. All right, this is looking a little better. I'm going to save one electroshock for later and a backup muscle for later. I'm going to mulligan 2 here. I'm just looking at what can I play. Okay, so looking pretty good. We would probably start with Imperial Inspections out. We would probably go ahead and throw out backup muscle. And again, I want to see where my opponent's going to do damage. So ideally here, I've got one resource remaining. I would potentially see maybe I roll a resource, maybe I don't, but if I do, then I might be able to play both of these cards, do a little mitigation if necessary, and then put the DH-17 on the character that's not being attacked. So your opening turn is not going to be one of these like, wham, I'm out, I did 9 damage turn 1, now come at me. It's going to be something where it's a little more slow, it's a little more deliberate, it's a little more thoughtful. But if you really take the time to set up the pieces of this deck and you do it properly, it is a very difficult deck to beat. You'll see if you haven't already watched the gameplay videos, please do so now. You'll kind of get a better idea of some of my decision making in game as we play against various different decks. And I hope you'll consider subscribing to my channel. I can't wait to talk to you about this deck and see what your thoughts are on FatBucket. And we'll definitely see you on the other side. So subscribe, hit the bell icon to get notified when I upload new videos, and we'll see you soon. Thanks so much.